Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and before I go any further, let me remind you to subscribe to Unplanned. We're going to have lots more interesting conversations to come. But on today's episode, we're thrilled to be joined by somebody who's going to tell us all about something called Fab Labs, which are very prominent here in the Boston, Cambridge, Somerville area. And then we're going to go on to a topic which is really her focus, which is Fab Cities. But she's going to tell us all about all of that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Julia Hansen, who is the manager of the Fab Lab at CIC, and she can tell us about that. Julia, it's wonderful to welcome you to Unplanned.
Thanks, Sam. I'm happy to be here speaking about Fab Labs and Fab City.
Well, Julia, thanks, and good to see you. So why don't we start with what you do in your day job? Why don't you tell us all about Fab Labs, what they are, and also about CIC and what it is, because it's kind of an important player in the local regional ecosystem here.
Sure. Well, CIC stands for Cambridge Innovation Center, which is a co-working and shared office space that has locations in Kendall, as well as Boston, here in Massachusetts, as well as a few other locations around the country and around the world. And CIC's mission is to help innovators do their best work. So for us, our role is providing excellent workspace where innovators can do what they do best within a community of other forward-thinking people. And the Fab Lab stands for Fabrication Laboratory. Is a lab in our Boston location. This is where I work. And we host 3D printers, laser cutters, what are known as digital fabrication tools, which allow our members, as well as people from the general public in the Boston area, to do rapid prototyping. So if we're thinking about the clientele that CIC serves, these could be design companies, medical device companies that need to quickly turn their ideas into physical things. And so they can do that by designing in software and then producing their idea in real life.
So let's spend one more second on CIC itself, and the role it plays in the regional or the local ecosystem and the economy here. I think it's fair to say it's an important player. And I'm curious what your take is on how you would describe CIC and its role both in the Kendall Square area and the Cambridge area, but more important, more broadly in the Boston regional area. How do you think about CIC and the role that it plays?
Well, CIC is really a very special place, not only because of its physical infrastructure, which at this point in the Boston area contains many floors of different types of office spaces that could allow an entrepreneur to start just by themselves with one shared desk and grow into a company of 50 people all within our spaces. But in addition to just providing great office space, there's also a community of people who are trying to solve the world's problems. And they often will interact with each other, help each other. And, in a community is where opportunities, often unexpected opportunities arise. So I think CIC has really contributed to what's been described as an innovation district in Kendall Square, and is looking to replicate that effect in the other places where we set up shop around the world.
Interesting. So let's fold in the Fab Lab. So where does the Fab Lab fit in all this? And you, I believe I got your title correct, are the manager or a manager at the Fab Lab in Boston. What do you do, and what does the Fab Lab do, and how does the Fab Lab relate to what CIC is trying to do?
Well, so for CIC, the Fab Lab provides infrastructure, a sort of design infrastructure, prototyping infrastructure that can be really important for a subset of our clients. So, a certain percentage, I'd say maybe 10 to 20% of our clients actually have to make things. And so being able to do that in the place where they work is critical to meeting, quick design sprint timelines, and also just allows their teams to be more efficient, because the alternative to creating your own prototype in-house would be to send out your design somewhere else. You'd wait a few days for it to get produced and then sent back to you. And that's, time and money.
I know that as COVID hit, and I'm curious about the impact of COVID on CIC in general, but also on the Fab Lab. I think you all got very active in the fight against COVID. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, at the beginning of the pandemic, so we, and as well as maker spaces and Fab Labs everywhere, understood that there was a shortage of PPE, which stands for personal protective equipment. So the
Oh,
mask,
masks, right?
shields,
Yep. Go on. Sorry. Go on.
and particularly in Boston, there was a tweet that circulated a lot, that was attributed to Dr. Slavin, who is, I think, the top guy at MGH. And he said, anyone with a 3D printer, please start making masks. And so there are a bunch of, maker spaces and individuals who have 3D printers, and they're like, yes, we will respond to this call. But the problem was that, like, there were no specifications on the type of PPE that was proven to work or that could even correctly be made.
What month are we talking about? When in the COVID crisis are we? Is this really first days, first weeks of COVID? Is it
second half of March, I would say?
okay?
Yeah,
Okay.
just started, and when there was a real concern that there would just be not enough PPE in hospitals,
Right. Which was legitimate, which was very legitimate, right? And it was rising in Massachusetts, and it was absolutely devastating in places like New York City, where anyway, that was the news. Go on. Don't let me interrupt you too much. Go on.
Well, so our makerspace got together with other makerspace managers and members, and started sharing information about what we were finding that was needed, like what designs were working. And each makerspace kind of went off and did what they could do best. And in our case, that was using our laser cutter to cut out patterns for a particular mask that's made out of cloth. And we assembled some volunteers to sew the masks together and then deliver them to places that had been in touch with us, saying that they desperately needed masks. So places like homeless shelters, nursing homes, social service organizations. And
what volumes are we talking about? What were you aiming to produce in terms of amounts, and what did you actually produce?
We initially aimed to do 1,000.
Yeah.
And ultimately we cut and distributed 5,000 or over 5,000.
And this is out of your Fab Lab right in the heart of downtown Boston. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
That's an amazing, that all by itself is an amazing story. Have you and your fellow Fab Lab and Makerspace participants ever taken a moment since then to just sort of reflect on what you accomplished in those early days, which were honestly, for all of us who are living in the Boston region, were quite frightening, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. I think, just speaking from a personal standpoint, this was a really great opportunity to show the world how important Fab Labs are, because there was a global crisis that was felt in each community, which was the lack of PPE. And Fab Labs and the people within Fab Labs were able to respond using their digital fabrication tools to create stuff that was not available through the traditional supply chain. So this was a critical moment, I think, for many of us to show the world what we were made of, in a way.
Well, I'm glad you had the opportunity to do that, and I think you obviously made a huge contribution, and it was an act of both courage and kindness for the communities that you were serving, which includes all of our communities here. But let's use that as a bridge to get onto the other topic that we wanted to talk about today, which is when you expand out this notion of a Fab Lab, which is this one singular place in a location. and you talk about it at a larger scale, namely the Fab Cities concept. Um, that has a whole lot of implications. That's a much more complicated problem to try to work through to solve. Why don't you give us an overview of what is the Fab Cities concept to begin with, and where we might go with this conversation to understand it a little bit more? What is Fab Cities?
So Fab Cities is a framework that envisions cities or larger geographical areas even as places that produce what its people need to consume. So the tagline really for Fab Cities is like, until we can produce everything that we consume within our location. And this drive comes from sort of two kind of parallel or really intersecting concerns. One is the concern for the environment and what our sort of standard supply chains for how, starting with how resources are extracted from the earth and then processed and then sent all over the world until finally they are in the hands of the consumer and then get into the trash. That's a very wasteful process, which I think the Fab Cities framework aims to adjust. And on the other hand is a social concern with what is it doing to people to not be connected to how the things that they use are made. And so it's looking at resources and how they are worked with and distributed, but also human capabilities and how we can, as communities, individuals, communities, can benefit in more than just, a consumerist way from having a relationship with the things that we use.
That's very, very interesting. So here we are in 2020. You've found a topic that's very interesting to you. We've talked about Fab Labs and we've talked a little bit about Fab Cities. What's been your takeaway about Fab Cities? How do they work, and how are they working right now?
Yeah, well, just to give a little more background on what Fab City actually envisions. So imagine that a city had workspaces or like workshops, digital fabrication labs, maker spaces, tool shops on every in every neighborhood, on every other block. And it were possible, feasible, desirable for you as a person, not being an architect, not being a product designer, just you as a regular person, to go in and fix the appliance in your house that is no longer working. So Fab Cities envisions people being able to solve their own problems, like where they are. And at the same time, I think Fab City also requires sort of like a cultural shift. And I think the demand for a more circular economy and for the ability to create more of the things that we use has to come, from consumers based on like the choices that they make, how they spend their money and where they buy things. But it also has to come from like investment into the capabilities of cities, regions, and that investment includes the technical means of production. And so the Fab City concept takes as a basis the widespread availability of Fab Labs, where anyone can go in and create the thing that they need. And then it builds up from there into a framework that includes policies that are favorable for the production of things locally, for the availability of Fab Labs, for the for laws that would make it easier to have Fab Labs in more places and easier for citizen science to be like adopted and valued.
All right, I'm going to jump in here because I think you've given us a pretty good overview of Fab Labs as conceived, as the concept goes. Can you now take us into where do we stand in all this? So you've been thinking about Fab Labs for a while now. The concept has been out there for 7, 8, 9, however many years. Who, and it started in Barcelona, as I
Mhm.
understand it. Where are we in the process? I mean, where would you evaluate our success? How far have we gotten in it? How far do we have to go? What are some of the next steps you see as important? What can you tell us about that?
Well, not too many people know this, but Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville are all Fab cities in the sense that about 6 years ago, the mayors of Boston and Cambridge and the city council of but Boston and Somerville and the council for Cambridge all signed on to the Fab City manifesto and said that it would be a good thing if these three cities could produce more of the things that are consumed in those cities.
And
Um,
where are they? I get the sense they haven't made huge strides in that, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'm
yeah,
wrong.
no, you would be right. I think the operationalization um, is the tough point because we can build a beautiful theory of how cities should work, how stuff should get made, but I think um, the clutch here is to show an example of a project that really brings benefit to its citizens. And I think that is what the network of Fab cities currently has as its greatest challenge.
Says, I'm going to jump back in here. What do you think it says overall, since we're in a time of deep questioning about kind of who we are in society more generally, about the Fab Lab concept, the Fab City concept, about the empowerment of people to solve their own problems? I think that's a theme that's running through many different parts of our public conversations. This seems to be a fabrication, maybe a more technological approach to some of the issues that are being raised. But I'm curious what you think it says about our ability as a society, as a community, to kind of solve our own problems. I think there's an environmental component, but there's also an empowerment component here. I'm hearing or understanding. What do you think about it?
Well, I think it's pretty evident that with technological innovation, a lot of people are getting left behind. And automation is causing job loss, but ultimately, like, I think the jobs that are being phased out due to automation are probably not jobs that are great for people anyway. Like the job of driving people around does not require the full abilities of a human with a human brain. If a machine brain can take care of certain aspects of what we need to get done, that's great, as long as we don't leave those people and their livelihoods behind. But the good news is that, um, if we can conceive of technological innovation in a way that goes hand in hand with human empowerment, like, we will always need the humans next to the robots in order to continue innovating. The robots are not going to innovate on themselves. They're just going to replace humans doing rote tasks, which humans shouldn't be doing anyways if we are totally valuing their abilities.
Well, you're raising lots of profound questions. I think we're not the first century that's considered what the impact of machines on humans will be. Um, and the interesting example that you chose of driving is an interesting one, because driving, as jobs go, probably isn't a bad job to have. It may be stressful at times, but as those things go, it's not bad. But it can potentially be replaced by an automated system. I want to be mindful of the time for Unplanned. We only have a certain number of minutes for each episode. If people wanted to find out more about Fab Cities and about Fab Labs and anything else related to what you've been talking about, where would you point them? Where should people go to learn a little bit more about what you're working on these days?
Well, the Fab City website is simply fab.city. And that will take you to a portal that shows all of the Fab cities in the world. I think there's several dozen at this point, as well as the sort of the framework broken down into layers of scale, starting from the Fab Labs at the foundation, going all the way up to urban and national policies that would support people making more of the things that they use.
And one final question: if people are interested in the concept and beyond going to the website and just reading more about it, what's one first step you would recommend or suggest to somebody who is interested, beyond learning more about it? What would you tell them to start with? Where would you tell them to start?
Definitely start by visiting a Fab Lab. This could be an invitation to visit the Fab Lab at CAC in downtown Boston. And I would say think of a problem that you would like to solve in your personal life, and and you know, create like a little roadmap for how you might actually go about solving that problem. And maybe it has a tech angle, maybe it doesn't. That's totally fine. But I think by sort of thinking outside the box of what's available already and thinking about like what do we actually need in our lives and how could we get there is a good way to start in one's personal mindset for thinking about why we should make more of the things that we use.
Well, Julia, you've given us a lot of information about a fascinating topic, and you've also raised a lot of really profound questions about how we act and interact with our environments and our products and et cetera. And there's a lot more to dig into in all of this. And I hope that we might have the chance to do more of that in the future. But for now, I want to thank you for giving us an introduction to Fab Labs and Fab Cities and how they work and what some of the concepts are. And just say thank you for joining us on Unplanned.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me.